on race, racism, and the contributions of African Americans in the health professions. So we start during the era of slavery. And it's important to understand that most of American history, African Americans have experienced a very oppressive life. We have slavery during a brief 12-year period between 1865 and 1877. We have what we call Reconstruction. Reconstruction was the Civil War ends, we get funding in the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau, funded by the federal government, pours money into creation of public schools, as well as hospitals and clinical facilities in the South. We then get the 13th Amendment, which bans slavery, the 14th Amendment, which naturalizes people who are born in this country, the 15th Amendment, which gives African Americans the right to vote. It's important to understand, though, that with the end of slavery, plantation owners and other landed gentry no longer had people to work the land. So Black codes were created and actually made it a crime to be homeless and without a job. And so this is the birth of what we now would call the criminalization of the Black population. It actually starts shortly after the end of the Civil War with these codes, and then gets solidified in 1896 with the Supreme Court decision on Plessy versus Ferguson. And then we move into the era of Jim Crow. And that's where we get the legal segregation and separation. African Americans lose the right to vote. That's where we rise with redlining and housing codes. And we'll talk about eugenics in the context of the end of Reconstruction and the rise of Jim Crow, because that context is critical to understanding the rise of white supremacy. George Frederickson is a well-known, very famous historian who published a book on racism. And he says when differences that might otherwise be considered ethnocultural are regarded as innate, indelible, and unchangeable, that a racist attitude or ideology can said to exist. So I open up with this context for us to understand and look more deeply at eugenics. So eugenics is a term that's coined by Galton in 1883. Galton is the cousin of Charles Darwin. And the idea is that the science of improving the stock. So looking at how we can improve the human race by studying how traits are inherited. We have stock of cattle, we have stock of horses, we have, various other farm animals that we are breeding to improve. And the idea is that we could take that same science and apply it to humans and speed up the process of evolution. Now, in this country, stock is an important term because the early eugenicists looked to the founding colonies, be that Plymouth and be that Jamestown. And the early eugenicists argued that those original settlers had unique genes, unique characteristics that gave them courage to leave the old land, the old country, survive the passage across the Atlantic, come to this country, settle, survive, and procreate. And it was those unique characteristics that people thought actually embodied the true American spirit. So race science to eugenics. Race science is as old as the 1600s. And it's the study of differences between Blacks and whites and other human beings to try to categorize human beings in racial categories. we move from race science into eugenic science, trying to identify how intelligence, moral character, physical prowess, beauty, how all those things are passed down from one generation to another, with the goal, actually, of creating future generations that are free of disabled, immoral, illiterate, so that society doesn't have to pay the costs of caring for the poor and the disabled. There were two kinds of eugenics that emerged. One emerged in England, and we call that positive eugenics. And so the upper class were given incentives to marry and have children, because English was a very class-based system. Negative eugenics found its home in America, where those that were considered genetically unfit were subjected to increasing systems of oppression. And that's what we'll talk about further. So eugenics occurs in a context. It arises at the end of Reconstruction in an era we call the redemptive era. And this is where African Americans begin to experience the Black codes, and the rise of white supremacy with the KKK really begins to take birth. That redemptive era of splenic racism, the most vehement kind of racism that we think of, morphs into what we call the progressive era. So Theodore Roosevelt is the prototypical progressive. This is also during the era of the rise of experimental science. So we have Pasteur, we have Virchow, we have Koch with the Koch principles, the 4 principles, and we have the rise of the germ theory of disease and the experimental method. And with this rise of natural experimental science, we get the rise of biologists, scientists, and physicians being considered elite members of society. The progressive era, this is the rise of the automobile, the shift from medical care from homes into hospitals. This is the rise of the assembly line, and the idea that progression was to make things more efficient and easily to accomplish. Since this is era of science, it was also the power of science to solve problems of society. So we've moved out of slavery, Reconstruction has ended, the redemptive era has morphed into the progressive era, and we now see the rise of white supremacy with the need to maintain class, race superiority, and gender, male, white, superior over white women, and clearly both of those over African Americans, Native Americans, and other minority groups, including Catholics and Jews. So the idea was that if society was analogous to the living organism, the body politic, then answers to societal problems could be found in the laws of nature. And this is an image that comes from the eugenics movement. And it's a powerful image because it illustrates how all these different disciplines were moving in to make eugenics part of popular culture. So we see this in Women's Home Journal, in Life magazine, on the radio, as part of state fairs. All this kind of popular attention as these eugenicists were using ideas from geology, archaeology, education, sociology, religion, to try to promulgate and to promote eugenics ideas into laws and policies. This is around the time when Gregory Mendel, who was an Austrian monk, his laws of inheritance were rediscovered. These come from the 18th century, and I learned this when I was in medical school: green peas, yellow peas. And this is what we now understand as autosomal dominant and autosomal recessive. And the eugenicists rediscovered this, and they thought, oh, wow, well, maybe we can see how blue eyes and brown eyes are inherited, and maybe we can identify how intelligence is inherited as an autosomal dominant, how sexual immorality is inherited maybe as an autosomal recessive. So the idea is that they could take these principles of genetics and apply them to understand human traits as a way to eventually prevent those individuals that they thought were unfit from procreating and allow those individuals who were the fittest to actually have children and to pass on those traits and characteristics. So race science and eugenics at UVA really comes into its own in the late 19th century and actually persists into the 1950s. And so the question I want you guys to think about throughout this talk, why did it last so long at UVA after it was clearly discredited in the 1930s and the 1940s? So the most important thing you need to understand is that UVA is the home of Thomas Jefferson. If you think of the South as the womb of UVA, then Jefferson is the father and the South is the mother. So Jefferson was widely read. He was probably one of the most prolific and one of the most widely read individuals in 18th and 19th centuries. He's not the founder of race science, but he's a major contributor to the promotion of race science because he is so widely read. And in 1785, in one of the few studies of Virginia that he publishes, this is on Notes of the State of Virginia, and he describes African Americans on the slaves that he has in Monticello. And as you can see, none of his descriptors are at all positive. Even though he has a slave at Monticello who's a French chef. Even though he has slaves at Monticello who have designed and built this exquisite architecture. Even though he has slaves at Monticello that are master stone carvers and obviously have skills above plain narrative, participate more in sensation than reflection. And as you can see, he's unable to equate the world that he sees, but puts very negative language out for others to read and to build upon. So Jefferson writes that the improvement of Blacks in body and mind in their mixture with whites proves that their inferiority is not the effect of merely their condition in life. And here we see Sally Hemings and her family, their family, and all the individuals that he knows are the descendants of both white slave owners and Black individuals on plantations. But he argues that inferiority is hereditary and it's not environmental. So he's unwilling to look at the environment of slavery as determinant in the condition that the African Americans are expressing and living in a slave space. The opinion that they, African Americans, are inferior in faculties of reason and imagination must be hazarded with great diffidence. To justify a general conclusion requires many observations, even where the subject may be submitted to the anatomical knife, the optical glasses, to analysis by fire or by solvents. It's important to understand that during this period of time in the 19th century, 18th century, the tool of scientists was observation and categorization, as well as anatomical dissection. So he's actually promoting this idea that, well, Blacks are inferior. In fact, maybe we should study that. So this is a book that was published recently by Maura McGinnis and Lewis Nelson, and I encourage all of you to read it. It's really a masterful piece of work. And it comes out of their scholarship as well as work of members of the President's Commission on a university in the era of slavery. And what we've learned is that slaves built Thomas Jefferson's University, and they manned this university for the first 50 years. They were beat, they were raped, they tended to the students, they tended to the faculty, and they also tended to the anatomical theater. Robley Dunlanson was the first professor of medicine at UVA. He was hired and was part of the original faculty. His ship from England was delayed. He arrived several months after the university opened. But in fact, as a first professor of medicine in one of the original departments, he builds this curriculum around medicine and argues to Thomas Jefferson that the university needs an anatomical theater because he does not want to do dissection in his pavilion home on the lawn. He actually is he is one of the most prolific writers in the 19th century. He writes human physiology and is known as a father of physiology. He never directly sees patients. He spends all of his time teaching, but he also teaches the students in dissection. And it's important to understand that the Black body in Thomas Jefferson's University was the first subject of scientific experimentation because Black graves were often robbed, and those Black bodies were used for the dissection purposes for the students in Dunlanson's program. So we're going to talk about these individuals who are very leading figures in UVA's history, and they shaped the emergence of race science and eugenics at UVA. James Cobble comes to us from Nelson County, just next door. He's born to a very, very large slaveholding family. He graduates from University of Virginia in 1933 with the university's highest degree, which is a master's degree. He then takes an MD at the University of Maryland. And actually, Dunlanson leaves UVA in 1935, goes to University of Maryland, so he must have been Cobble's faculty there. Cobble goes on to postgraduate training in France. It's important to understand that all of the most elite physicians in this country in the 19th century go to Europe, and there they learn their clinical science, and many of them start working in the science laboratories of Pasteur, Virchow, Koch, and others. So he is part of this elite group that trains abroad, comes back, and joins the faculty as a third professor of medicine. He rises to become chair of the faculty, which is the equivalent today of president of the university. It's important to understand that Cobble is perceived as an innovator. He adopts asepsis, which is a new idea, which the idea of asepsis is that if you sterilize things, you can decrease the transmission of bacteria, say in the operating room and other clinical spaces. So as a surgeon, he adopts asepsis. As an innovator, he helps found the American Public Health Association. He is its second president. Here in Charlottesville, he directs the Civil War Hospital, which is considered one of the cleanest and one of the institutions in the South with the lowest death rate because of his innovation. And as you can see, he's here for 52 years. So you can imagine this guy's going to have a major impact. So I started off my slide looking at the timeline, and one of the people on that timeline was an individual called Morton, Dr. Morton. And he actually argued that the different races in the emergence of race science actually emerged from different descendants. So this idea of polygenism, in the fact that we are all descendants from a variety of different people. We now know there's 15,000 people that moved out of Africa and we're all descendants of that group, versus the Christian belief that we were all descendants of Adam and Eve. And this idea of monogenism versus polygenism was a widely debated topic within the scientific community in the 19th century. So Cobble takes on this question. He now is from a slave-owning family. He brings his slaves here. And so therefore, he is part of a pro-slavery culture at UVA. At the time of the Civil War, out of the 600 students that are here, 90% join the Confederate Army. This is a pro-slavery institution. Jefferson created UVA in part to take the elite young men of planters and the gentry and to train them up in the ideas of the South. So Cobble's task is to argue, are we descendants of Adam and Eve, or are we descendants of multiple individuals? And he ultimately argues that good Christians are slave-owning people and they believe in Adam and Eve. So he says we're descendants of Adam and Eve, that over generations, environmental pressures create varieties. And these varieties then become permanent characteristics. So in a sense, he's arguing that if we can say we're all descendants of Adam and Eve, we're all divine we're all divine creatures in the eyes of God. And maybe God designed this institution of slavery as a benign institution to help rise up some of those races that over generations had evolved into less individuals because of the acquisition of these permanent characteristics that then put them below the white population. And he writes, contact with whites under the benign institutes of slavery may have been intended by the merciful and wise providence of God as the only means of extricating blacks from their otherwise inevitable destiny, which was a savage nature, because they had come from the wilds of Africa. So Beringer succeeds Cobble in this role of promoter of race science. He's an UVA undergraduate. He studies under Cobble. He becomes sick as an undergraduate student. Cobble takes care of him. He gets well. And when Cobble retires, he actually asks Beringer to take on his seat as a professor. So Beringer also has roots to colonial Virginia. His family are very large slave owners. His grandfather served in the War of 1812. His father was part of the general service in the Civil War, and then went to North Carolina and created what we will call the Redeemer racist government of North Carolina post-Civil War. He meets Jefferson Davis while he's a child, and he has a lifelong belief that blacks are inferior because of his upbringing on this large slave-owning plantation. 70 years later, after the slaves were released, he still remembers the day they walked off and argues it was the hardest day of his life, realizing the only thing that kept his slaves on the land was the whip and the chain. So as I said, Beringer trained under Cobble. He graduated from UVA Medical School. He then takes a second medical degree at NYU. He interns at Bellevue. And he, like Cobble and other elite physicians, goes to Europe and studies under Pasteur. So he is steeped in the experimental method. He comes back and he actually illustrates at his first paper the use of the microscope on the identification of the spirochete. So he emerges as a man of science, but imbued in the ideas of race science. He, like his mentor, rises to be chair of the faculty. He advises in the hiring of other UVA faculty. He trains hundreds of students. And as part of his effort to raise UVA to national prominence, he reforms the medical school curriculum, including basic science and clinical training, with the construction of UVA's first hospital, which opens in 1901. It's important to understand that Barringer's scientific training and authority, his prominence among Southern educators, and his enduring influence upon students, largely children of Virginia's elite, put him in a position of great power. His ideas influenced generations of Virginians by modernizing their cultural prejudices and placing them on a foundation formed by the most recent science. You could also argue that in some ways, Cobble drafted the outline and Barringer filled in the details and prepared the blueprint for Virginia's 20th century eugenics edifice. In 1900, as chair of the faculty, so the equivalent of president of the university, he publishes 3 treatises. And he emerges as the expert on the Negro problem. Now, I want you to understand that at the turn of the century, African Americans had left the plantation. We see Reconstruction and the emergence of enormous Black agency. So you get the rise of Black medical schools established by Black physicians, the rise of Black hospitals established by Black physicians, the rise of Black nursing schools established by Black nurses, the rise of Black banks, Black businesses, the election of Black officials to state and national legislatures. You also see the movement of African Americans from the plantation into urban settings. And they're often ghettoized in the worst neighborhoods. And we don't yet have the rise of clean water, sanitation, safe employment practices. We don't even have public health departments that ensure safe food products. So with the congregation of African Americans in these ghettoized neighborhoods in Charleston, in Nashville, in Charlottesville, in Wilmington, in Durham, in all these neighborhoods and communities in the South, we get the enormous rise of infection, tuberculosis, syphilis, malaria, yellow fever, cholera, typhoid. And so he's writing on what he's observing, but he's also using the data that's being generated by physicians with this perspective of white supremacy and race science. He, like Cobble, believed there was a rigid hereditary determinism in the sense that there was a predetermined absolute limit of what African Americans could achieve intellectually, socially, politically. And he also writes, with emancipation came reversion to savage status, creating a new degenerate Black generation that could not possibly survive in contact with white society. And remember, I told you that this era, we see the rise of Black codes. So all these landed gentry needed people to work the land. So they would arrest African Americans if they didn't have a home and they didn't have a job. They would put them in penal colonies and then hire them out at a fraction of what they were worth to work the land, basically as free labor again. So Barringer argued that the Negro problem really was a massive public health problem because of this high incidence of disease. And rather than look at the environment in which African Americans were forced to live, he argued that Blacks were genetically unfit, whites were genetically fit. Not only does he write this, but he travels all around the South and is invited to give speaking engagements in the North, where he continues to promulgate these ideas. As now president of the University of Virginia, a distinguished medical educator, the architect of UVA's medical curriculum. And so what we see is that he justifies really the intervention of Jim Crow with political disenfranchisement of African Americans here locally and throughout the state. He argues for transferring Black education from Black to white teachers. And he also argues that Blacks should be trained simply to be law-abiding laborers. Now, if you know anything about Black education, you know from the Jefferson School here in Charlottesville that it was those Black teachers who were imparting into those Black students a drive to succeed. And they were imparting not only a drive to succeed, but the intellect and the skills and the knowledge to enable them to do that. So what he's doing is basically crafting a formula for failure of the Black population, not only here in Charlottesville, but throughout the South. His third addresses Negro education in the South, and he argues, as you can see, that every Negro doctor, lawyer, teacher, or other leader in excess of the immediate needs of his own people is an antisocial product and a social menace. Now, if you look at Charlottesville, you'll see that there are very, very few health professionals here. In contrast to Richmond, Norfolk, Durham, those other cities have actually Black hospitals. Raleigh, that actually has a Black medical school. So there are areas within the South that are rising up these health professionals that Beringer is sure bound and determined to try to squelch and to keep at an absolute minimum. In 1907, he is passed over as president of the university, and so he goes to Virginia Polytechnic as its president, and after 7 years retires back to Charlottesville and is seen to interact continuously with the students. We'll end up talking about Tuskegee study, but I want you to appreciate that a man with this rabid racism gets involved in advocating for eugenic laws. President Alderman comes to UVA in 1904 from University of North Carolina, where he really is considered a preeminent and innovative educator. He is determined to maintain the culture of UVA as a Southern institution. And as we see, he decides to modernize the university via research, invests in the research program, but he chooses eugenics as the research that he will recruit faculty to do. As you can see here in the early 20th century, having a university degree is a very elite accomplishment. And that the rise of eugenics is not only here at UVA, but it's occurring throughout the country. From 1914 to 28, we get eugenics courses now incorporated into 378 colleges and universities around the country. William Heck is one of his first hires. He comes in to the School of Education. He has spent a summer at Woods Hole learning eugenics from some of the eugenics aficionados. He incorporates the first eugenics class into education activities, and he takes his ideas on the summer circuit. And this is UVA's way of increasing the knowledge and the skills of the Commonwealth public teachers, as well as other faculty at other institutions. I'm going to move to Ivy Foreman Lewis, who becomes the chair of biology. He is recruited here into that role, already having had a very distinguished career. Before he comes, he's actually spent a lot of time at Woods Hole, and if you had a chance to watch Eugenics Crusade, Woods Hole and Cold Spring Harbor are equivalent. They are places that during the summer, the leading eugenicists go to. Other graduate students go to Woods Hole and to Cold Spring Harbor. They spend the summer learning eugenics research techniques from these individuals, and then they go back to their respective colleges, universities, and continue that research during the year, coming back during the summer, collaborating again with this national group of experts. Lewis sought to ensure that all educated Virginians exercise their citizenship informed by a solid understanding of the biologic laws determining social organization. And as a eugenicist, he rises from chair of biology to assistant dean to dean of the College of Arts and Sciences from 46 to 53. He believes that God allowed humans to discover natural laws in order to improve their condition on earth. It's a very common idea that you hear among the eugenicists. This idea of hereditary determinism, which Lewis believed was a natural law created by God and discovered by science, could be controlled through eugenics. And that ultimately a eugenically improved population would be better equipped to receive moral instruction, for there would be no more moral delinquents. And part of the important principle here is efficiency. It would be a lot more efficient to develop the most morally upright citizens, because then we could impart the proper instruction and it would be assimilated all that much faster. So Lewis is very much linked to Woods Hole. He goes there as faculty, and actually he runs the program at Woods Hole for 10 years. He collaborates with leading eugenicists and does family studies with them. He becomes, as Dean of Arts and Sciences, he travels throughout Virginia along with the other faculty, promoting the promises of eugenics to teachers and the public. As you can see, as chair of biology, he requires his course for all biology graduates. And in this course, he includes material on eugenics. There's a paper we'll look at next year, which actually describes some of the student papers from this course and how they're using this material that Lewis is teaching. As you can see, he trains over 900 students. Biology has the largest number of majors, a lot of graduate students, and as you can imagine, a lot of future doctors and others. The U.S. Public Health Service in the early 1920s, 16% of them were graduates of UVA, coming out with a biology focus, probably for many of them. So they are being steeped in this idea of eugenics as undergraduates, then moving to become citizen leaders. He takes his ideas on eugenics, moves them into university policy, forbids women to be admitted, has very, very negative feelings about the Jewish students that are here, and obviously African Americans are excluded. So we'll touch back on Alderman because as leader of the university, he truly believes in the role of experts, not only improving society at large, but making Virginia a leading center of industrial growth. He invests in the School of Medicine money based on the university's assets, of which there are not really many. And so in US dollars, there's over 13 million spent. And the medical school uses this money to expand the hospital on several different ways with gifts that are given by other individuals. And it's important to note just off the bat that from the time the hospital opens in 1901 until the 1950s, the African Americans who are admitted are put in the basement, and they do not move out of those basement wards until the 1950s. So Alderman is very active in strengthening the eugenics focus of individuals in the School of Medicine. And we're now going to move to one of the most notorious, whose name has finally been taken off of building, and that's Harvey Jordan. He was born to Pennsylvania farmers in the late 19th century. He has a very, very impressive academic record. He's trained at Princeton. He also is part of the summer institutes at Woodhull and Cold Spring Harbor from 1905, 1906, 1907, and 1908. As you can see, he's prolific, publishing 177 articles and 3 books, and he emerges as one of the most highly respected educators in the South. As soon as he arrives at UVA, he's made chairman of the admissions committee in the School of Medicine. As you might imagine, the School of Medicine does not admit Blacks and does not admit women. And he rises to become dean of the School of Medicine for 10 years, the late Depression during the war period. He collaborates with leading eugenicists. I should say that he's brought here to teach histology, embryology, genetics, and eugenics. And his research is in all of those fields. He studies left-handedness and skin color, and he finds that left-handedness is more frequent in African Americans. And he publishes that around the time when an Italian study comes out that says that left-handedness is correlated with criminality. So I hope you're getting this idea that the research that these individuals are doing is really designed to reinforce a race hierarchy and the ideas of white supremacy. He argues that to individuals that are part of this Cold Spring Harbor and Woods Hole community, that they should come to Virginia and study the dysgenic branch of Virginia ancestral tree. That becomes one of the most famous projects, and it's called the Mongrels of Virginia. And in fact, the Eugenics Research Organization researcher Arthur Easterbrook investigates a tribe and publishes a study, Mongrel Virginians, that becomes a cornerstone of Eugenics, eugenic public policy and education. And it's actually at Jordan's suggestion that that work is carried out. He's a member of national and international eugenic societies, and as you can see at the First International Congress, he argues that every future medical curriculum must include a sound course in eugenics. He publishes widely used textbooks. I trained in medicine in the era where we used textbooks. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have online materials. And so actually what was published in textbooks we considered to be gospel, the truth. And we'll look next week at Harvey Jordan's eugenics chapters in his embryology books. And I note that over 720 hours in the curriculum were taught with Robert Bean, another eugenicist. This is about 1/5 of the total curriculum medical students exposed to these ideas. He actually believed that susceptibility to infection was hereditary. He focused a lot on syphilis. He argued that people with illness, syphilis, tuberculosis, malaria, other illnesses, should be compulsory, they should be registered and forced into segregated space and prevented from marrying and having children through eugenic sterilization. Robert Bean, as I mentioned just briefly, came to UVA in 1916 as chair of anatomy. He has a distinguished academic background, having graduated from Hopkins and training under Franklin Mall, who is probably the preeminent anatomist in the country. And he spent his life trying to prove the differences between the races in what we would call is the prototypic race science of comparative anatomy. He took 152 white brains, and then measured them. This is the classic race science measurements. And he said, wow, there's a striking pattern that emerges. White brains are larger, mulatto brains are in the middle, and African-American dark-skinned blacks are the smallest. I should add, though, that Franklin Mall repeated this study, did not find any correlation between the size of brain and someone's skin color, challenged him and said, Bean, your data is not correct, but Bean got it published. and therefore part of the public discourse. It's important to understand that Bean was not only a scientist with his anthropometric measurements, but he was also a publicist. And he argued that human types that represent different degrees of susceptibility to disease, African American, genetically unfit, more susceptible to disease, like Harvey Jordan and himself were arguing, should not receive the same treatment as the genetically fit. And therefore, it was fine for them to be segregated into the basement and denied adequate service and interventions. At the Second International Conference in 1921, Bean gave a paper where he argues that walking erect was not the natural posture of an African American because they really were supposed to walk on four limbs, and that the well-developed musculature on the back was a result of the extra strain of having to work to stand erect. Now, this is where we're now seeing that biased policies are fueling pseudoscience, where Virginia law allowed medical schools to claim the bodies of the executed criminals, unclaimed individuals who died while incarcerated, and the bodies of indigent who often were subject to these penal colonies and hard labor, all of whom were most likely to be African American and subjected to very cruel labor conditions. I put all these circles around these guys because I need you guys to understand that these guys collaborated across grounds: biology, education, medical school, and then there are other individuals in sociology and actually in our Biologic Research Institute managed by Orlando White. George Oscar actually succeeds, Ferguson succeeds his colleague in the School of Education, and he brings to UVA the IQ test. And his research, published when he was a graduate student at William and Mary, was on the use of intelligence tests to categorize the intelligence of African Americans, mulattoes, and whites. And as you would imagine, even though he says they're matched socially and scholastically, he does not control for the school conditions that Black children go to versus white children. And so here again, you see science being used to promulgate an idea and reinforcing this idea of white supremacy. Taking that on the road, Ferguson argues it does not seem possible to raise the scholastic attainment of the Negro to an equality with that of the whites. No expenditure of time or money would accomplish this end. Since education cannot create mental power, it can only develop that which is innate. So I argue that these individuals were really creating a culture of white supremacy that was justified by the objective race science of eugenics. So Robert Bean and Lewis together started Sigma Chi Science Honor Society in 1923. They invite eugenics speakers on several occasions. And as you can see, when Bean is doing his work on brains, you can imagine that women's brains were smaller than men's brains. And all the faculty here, I just show this picture because all the faculty are white and are male. So I'm going to end with just touching on Tuskegee, because I think it's important for us to end with a science study that was born out of eugenics at UVA. So Tuskegee is the infamous testing, or the infamous acquisition, the infamous recruitment of African Americans who were diagnosed with syphilis. There were 399 men who were recruited into this study from an area, in Alabama. What you might not know is the Surgeon General of the U.S. Public Health Service at the time was a graduate of UVA, Hugh Cummings. Taillefer Clark, who piloted the original study beginning in 1929 and continued it, taking it as Assistant Surgeon General. He then headed the venereal department. So he not only started it in 1929, but he continued it as director of the Department of Venereal Disease within the U.S. Public Health Service. Taillefer was also a graduate of UVA, Taillefer Clark, and Raymond Wanderlair was also a UVA alumni. And Wanderlair was chosen by Clark to actually head the Public Health Service Tuskegee study team beginning in 1938 that he then oversaw as head of the Division of Venereal Disease. So the Tuskegee study actually, by those with the lens of eugenics, would argue it was the perfect eugenics study. There was a cohort of all white individuals from Norway who had been followed for 10 years. The study started in 1910 and they were continued for 10 or 15 years, and it was looking at untreated syphilis in the white population. So this population of 399 Black men diagnosed with syphilis or bad blood were to be followed without treatment. And what these individuals believed is that African Americans were both susceptible to syphilis because of an inherited susceptibility, and because of that inherited susceptibility, they also had less ability to fight it. And so they wanted to study it, and they believed that it was going to manifest itself physiologically different in the Black population than it would in the white population. And so these individuals start actually doing all these kinds of studies, and they argue that Blacks have a higher incidence of cardiovascular disease and other complications. Ultimately, penicillin is discovered during World War II. It is made available publicly right after the war, and it is immediately identified as a silver bullet. None of these individuals were ever offered penicillin by the study architects or the individuals administering the project. And so ultimately, eugenics justifies disenfranchisement, segregation, disproportionate funding, immigration restriction, marriage restriction, sterilization of the mentally ill, and massive white resistance to desegregation of public education, which we can talk about next week in a variety of different formats. And with that, I'm going to stop and just open up for Q&A and see if we want to go into small chat groups. Rob has some discussion questions if we want to go into chat groups and talk about them in more depth.
Well, yeah. Thank you very much for giving that talk, Dr. Preston Reynolds. That was great. I really enjoyed learning about that, and I think that was really helpful for a lot of us. So as she alluded to, we'd like to have more of a we're going to have a small like Q&A session to talk about now, answer any questions and discussion. But next week, we'd like to have more a journal club like talk where we can read some of this actual work and better understand some of the primary sources on like how this idea could really, like the idea of eugenics as a science could be so pervasive and prevalent in our society, even though is debunked. And